The desert outside Crook's Hollow was the kind of place that didn't apologize for itself. It spread in every direction without mercy or variation. Red rock and pale dust and the occasional gray scrub that looked more dead than alive clinging to the hard pan with the stubborn indifference of something that had simply forgotten how to quit. The sky above it was white with heat, not blue, white. The kind of white that pressed down on a man's shoulders and made the air itself feel heavy and used. The wagon rolled through it slowly. Emmett Holt sat on the buckboard with the reins loose in his rough hands, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way a man's eyes fix on nothing when he's stopped expecting anything from the horizon. He was 38 years old and lean, in the way that hard work and lean years make a man lean, not wiry, not slight, but stripped down to what was necessary. He didn't speak much, he never had. But 11 days of dry camp and failing water, and a map that grew less certain with every mile, had reduced him to something even quieter than his natural self. A kind of careful silence. The silence of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the numbers. Beside him sat Vera. She was 34, dark-haired, her hair pinned back under a calico bonnet that had once been the color of a clear sky and was now the color of everything else out here, faded and sun-bleached, and still somehow holding its shape. She held a canteen in her lap. She had not drunk from it in 2 hours. Not because she wasn't thirsty. She was very thirsty. But Vera Holt had a way of measuring things, water-time patience, hope, that had nothing to do with how she felt and everything to do with what was left and how far it still had to go. Her eyes moved. That was the thing about Vera that a person noticed if they watched her long enough. Emmett had noticed it 7 years ago, and he still found himself noticing it now. While he looked straight ahead, reading the horizon for threats and distances the way a man does, Vera's eyes moved. Across the rock face, along the base of the canyon walls, up the tilted shelves of sandstone, down into the dry washes where the ghost of old water still drew a faint dark line in the earth. She wasn't looking for danger. She was looking for something else entirely. Something she wouldn't have been able to name easily, but that she'd know when she saw it. Between them sat Jasper. He was 5 years old and entirely unfazed by the desert, which said something about either his temperament or his lack of imagination, and Vera had decided early on that it was temperament. Jasper Holt was not a child who suffered quietly. He was a child who genuinely didn't suffer, who found the color of the rocks interesting, who wanted to know why the cactus had needles instead of leaves, who had spent the better part of yesterday afternoon trying to determine whether the lizards they passed were the same lizards or different lizards at each stop. He was chewing the last of a dried apricot, now working it slowly with his back teeth and watching the north face of the canyon wall with the serious attention of a small person who was thinking hard about something. They had tried Kansas. Kansas had given them 2 good seasons, real seasons, the kind that fill a root cellar and settle a debt and make a man think maybe he has finally put his foot down on solid ground. Then the drought came. It didn't come fast or dramatically. It came the way bad things often come slowly and then all at once, and by the time Vera had understood what was happening, the well was dropping a foot a month, and the seedlings were curling at the edges, and there was nothing to do but watch it go. They left with the wagon and the horses and the tin box of seeds that Vera had packed at the center of her clothing trunk wrapped in oilcloth, and they did not look back because looking back at a dried field serves no one. They had tried the eastern edge of New Mexico after that. The grassland there had looked like promise, wide and flat and colored that particular pale green that means moisture below the surface. Emmett had filed a claim and broken ground in the first week. Vera had walked the field in the early mornings reading the soil between her fingers and told him she thought it could work. It could have worked. But a late frost came the first spring, then the second, then the third, killing the seedlings 3 times running, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from one failure, but from the same failure repeated with enough time in between each one for hope to rebuild itself. They left New Mexico in February, which is a hard month to leave anywhere, and the cold had followed them west for 4 days before it let go. Now they were here. The Arizona Territory in late summer of 1888 ran in long, tilted shelves of red and orange sandstone, cracked and powdered by decades of killing sun. And the man in Tucson who had sold them the map, a land agent named Pruitt, who had the careful enthusiasm of someone selling something he himself would never buy, had spoken with measured confidence about a valley corridor near a place called Red Mercy Gap. Good water possibilities, he'd said. Unclaimed ground. A man willing to work, it could make something there. The map had grown increasingly vague. The water possibilities had not materialized. 11 days. Vera shifted the canteen in her lap without drinking from it, and her eyes moved along the north face of the canyon wall, and Jasper finished his apricot and said without any particular excitement, the way a child says a thing they consider obvious. There's a crack in that rock. Emmett pulled the horses up. He stood in the buckboard and shaded his eyes with one hand. 200 yards north, a thin vertical shadow cut the face of a massive sandstone wall, a dark seam barely wider than a man's body running from near the ground up into the stone it as far as the eye could follow. It was not dramatic. It was not what anyone would call promising. It was a shadow in a rock face and nothing more. And Emmett studied it for a long moment and said, "It's just a seam in the stone." Vera was already climbing down. She didn't hurry. That was the other thing about her. She almost never hurried, but she moved with a kind of directness that made hurrying seem beside the point. She picked her way across the rust-colored gravel in her worn boots, one hand still on the canteen, her eyes on the shadow in the wall. Emmett watched her go and then tied the reins and lifted Jasper down and followed. The crack was real. Up close, it was even narrower than it had looked from the wagon, perhaps 20 inches at its widest point, and the stone on either side rose sheer and smooth for 60 feet or more. The rock face was warm under the hands soaked through with a day's worth of sun, but the air near the opening was different. Not just cooler, something else, a quality of moisture, a hint of something green and dark and alive that had no business existing out here. Vera leaned close to the opening and breathed in through her nose. She stood like that for a moment. "Wet stone," she said. Emmett leaned in beside her. "Could be nothing. A pocket of shadow." Vera didn't answer. She turned sideways and put one foot into the crack. "Stay with your father," she told Jasper, and she went in. Emmett stood outside with his son and listened to the sound of her boots on stone and then nothing. The desert wind moved past them, and the horses shifted in the traces, and Jasper looked at his father with an expression that was not worried exactly, but attentive. Emmett waited. He was good at waiting. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Jasper said, "Is Mama coming back?" "She's coming back," Emmett said. She came back in 7 minutes, squeezing through the cracks sideways, and her face had changed. It was the same face, the same dark eyes, the same line of her mouth, the same calm that she wore like a working garment. But something behind it was different. Something had shifted the way the light shifts when a cloud moves off the sun, and you don't notice the cloud itself, only the sudden quality of the ground. Emmett looked at her. Well, Vera looked at him. Then she looked at the crack in the wall. Then she looked at the desert stretching behind them, in every direction, flat and merciless and empty, in the way that things are empty when they have taken everything they're going to take. "You need to go in," she said. He went in. The passage was close and dim, the stone wall brushing both his shoulders. He moved forward, carefully 10 steps, 15, the passage bending slightly to the left, and then it opened without warning into a space that made him stop entirely. A narrow canyon chamber, perhaps 40 feet wide and 150 feet long, sealed on all sides by sheer red walls that caught and held the last of the afternoon light. The floor was sand and gravel and flat stones, and down the left wall in 3 places, he could identify immediately a water seeped steadily through the rock face, thin and quiet, barely wider than a man's finger, running down the stone and collecting in shallow basins worn smooth by years of patient accumulation. Moss grew in dark green ruffles along the damp sections of wall. A single cottonwood had taken root in the back corner, young, real, its leaves trembling in a cool draft that moved through the passage. Emmett stood there. He was not a man given to strong feeling, or at least not to showing it. But standing in that hidden canyon with the water running quiet down the walls and the smell of green things around him and the desert sealed away on the other side of the rock, something moved through him that he didn't have a word for. It was not happiness exactly. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of a door opening in a house you'd forgotten you were looking for. He came back through. Vera was waiting, arms crossed, her expression composed into something carefully neutral in the way it got when she was thinking hard and didn't want to show the direction of her thoughts. Emmett said, I think it might be the best thing I've ever walked into." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the wall and said, "I know." That night, they made camp outside the crack. Emmett built a small fire and they ate what was left of the cornbread from 3 days ago and didn't talk much. Jasper fell asleep with his head on Vera's rolled-up coat, one fist curled near his chin, entirely untroubled by the question of what tomorrow would bring. Emmett lay on his bedroll and looked at the stars and did the arithmetic again. Water, soil, space-time, winter coming, and somewhere in the middle of it, he slept. Vera did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wagon wheel and her knees drawn up, and she looked at the crack in the wall for a long time. It showed as a thin darkness in the rock face, barely visible in the starlight, just a seam in the stone. But she knew what was behind it. She'd stood in it and breathed it and measured it with her eyes, and now she sat in the dark of the Arizona desert and did what she always did when she was deciding something important. She thought it through completely. Not hopefully, not fearfully, completely. She thought about the water first. 3 separate seeps continuous. She'd held her palm under the largest one and felt the flow. Not a trickle, not a drip. A genuine flow, slow and steady, the kind that didn't come and go with the season, but rose from something deep and reliable underground. She thought about what 3 seeps of clean water could do in a sheltered space 40 feet wide if a person built the right kind of basins and channels. She thought about the soil gravel and fine red sand on the canyon floor. Not much for roots, but there was a dry wash 2 miles south where windblown dust had been accumulating for decades. She'd seen it from the wagon 2 days ago and noted it without knowing why. She knew why now. She thought about the walls. 60 feet of sheer red stone on all sides, brutal at noon, she guessed, when the sun came straight down, but sheltering the rest of the day. A narrow strip of direct sun in the late morning moving across the canyon floor. And the south-facing wall, which would hold heat long into the evening, she'd felt it when she ran her hand along it in the dim interior, the stone warm in a way that had nothing to do with the air temperature. That was a growing wall. She'd known it without knowing she knew it. She thought about the cottonwood. A cottonwood is not a sentimental tree. It is a practical tree. It grows where water is, not where water might be. Where water is. The fact that it had rooted itself in the back corner of that canyon and was still alive, young, but alive, its leaves trembling, meant something that no map and no land agent and no surveyor could have told her. It meant the water was real. She stayed awake until the sky began to gray in the east. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the crack in the wall one more time and made the decision the way she made every decision that mattered, not by choosing what she wanted, but by choosing what was true. In the morning, while Emmett was boiling the last of the coffee and Jasper was crouched by the wagon wheel examining a beetle, Vera stood up and stretched and said simply, "We're staying." Emmett looked at her over the fire. "Vera, we're staying," she said again. Not harder, not louder, just again with the same quiet certainty. "There's water in there, real water, and soil I can bring in, and walls that'll shelter a crop through the worst of the summer heat. We've passed 6 good-looking pieces of ground in 3 territories, and none of them were what they look like. This one looks like nothing, but it's the right kind of nothing." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Jasper looked up from his beetle. "Are we living in the rock?" "Next to it," Vera said. "Is the beetle coming?" "The beetle lives here already," Vera said. "We're the ones moving in." They unloaded the wagon that morning. Vera directed it where to pile the tools, where to stake the horses, so they could reach whatever sparse grass grew along the base of the canyon wall, how to position the wagon as a temporary wind shelter while they worked. Emmett did what she said without comment or revision, which was one of the things Vera had understood about him early. He was not a man who needed to be the one who decided. He needed to be the one who built. Give Emmett a direction and a problem, and he would work himself past exhaustion to solve it. The deciding was Vera's. They had been married 7 years. It worked. The first task was the water, and this was Vera's entirely. She spent the better part of 3 days in the canyon alone, or as alone as she could be, with Jasper underfoot asking questions and carrying things. She moved through the space methodically, watching the 3 seep points on the left wall, observing the flow at different times of day, tracing the paths the water took down the stone and into the gravel, and where it disappeared and was lost. She scratched notes on the back of the useless land agent's map with a stub of pencil, not plans exactly, but observations. The way the water moved, where it pooled naturally, where the stone floor had been worn smooth by old accumulation. The largest seep was halfway down the canyon on the left wall, about 4 feet off the ground. It ran as a thin sheet across a smooth face of rock before breaking into 3 separate fingers and draining into a natural gravel depression below. Vera cleared the gravel depression, first digging down 18 inches with a short-handled spade, examining the subsoil carefully. It was better than she'd expected, darker, with some organic content, probably centuries of accumulated plant matter from the seep. She lined the base with flat stones pried from the canyon floor. She built up the edges with mortared stone red clay from the canyon walls mixed with fine sand and a small amount of water from the seep itself mixed by hand until it held. On the second day, the basin was finished. It was 2 feet deep and 6 feet across, and by evening it had filled completely and stayed full. The water level steady, the overflow running quietly over the low stone lip she'd left on the downhill side. She sat on the edge of it and looked at what she'd made. Jasper came and crouched beside her and put both hands flat into the water and inhaled sharply at the cold. "It's cold," he said. "Yes." "Is it our pond?" "It's our water," Vera said. From the basin, she cut a shallow channel in the stone floor. Over the next 2 days, patient, careful work, the chisel, biting slowly into the red rock, while Jasper played in the growing pile of stone chips and invented stories about them. She angled the channel, precisely testing the slope with small pores from a tin cup, adjusting recutting. The water had to move, but it had to move slowly enough to be useful. She lined the channel with fitted flat stones, working them in without mortar, finding the angles by hand, wasting nothing. On the 5th day, she opened the basin's spillway and the water ran. It moved down the channel in a thin, bright line, following the cut she'd made at Takali, and at the bottom of the channel, it spread into the center of the canyon floor, into the area Vera was already beginning to think of privately and without sentimentality as the garden. She built the other 2 seep basins the same way, smaller but the same method, the same red clay mortar, the same patient fitting of stone. By the end of the first week, all 3 seeps fed into a system that carried water from the canyon walls to the garden floor in a series of connected channels. It was not elaborate, it was not beautiful, but it worked, and it worked reliably, and in Vera's estimation, that was worth more than either elaboration or beauty. Meanwhile, Emmett hauled soil. He'd taken the detail about the dry wash 2 miles south without comment or question, the way he took most of Vera's observations, and on the 3rd day he'd driven out with the empty wagon bed and come back 4 hours later with 300 pounds of dark, loamy earth that smelled of a dozen wet seasons accumulated and compressed. He made 12 trips over 4 days, transferring the soil into the canyon through the narrow crack by the bucket load, stacking it in the growing garden area with methodical patience. Jasper helped on the 6th trip, carrying a small pail with both hands and, his tongue between his teeth, walking very slowly and very seriously from the wagon to the crack and back. The terraces were Vera's. She had not planned terraces exactly. She had planned planting beds. But looking at the canyon floor, uneven, sloping slightly toward the entrance, she understood within the first day that terrace beds would hold the soil and the water better than flat ones, and that the slope could be made to work for her instead of against her. She sorted the flat sandstone slabs that littered the canyon floor by size and thickness, which took most of an afternoon, and then she began building. She didn't draw it out first. She started with the back corner closest to the cottonwood, where the soil was naturally deepest and the walls would provide the most protection from the afternoon sun. She fitted the first course of stone with a steel pry bar and her own judgment, standing each slab on edge, angling it slightly backward into the slope and filling behind it with the dark soil Emmett had hauled in. Then the second course, then the third. At the terrace was 18 inches high when she finished it, 6 feet deep, front to back, 12 feet across. She stood back and looked at it. Then she built another. She built 4 terraces in 6 days. The muscles in her forearms and shoulders ached with a depth she hadn't felt since New Mexico, and her palms were crossed with small cuts from the stone edges. And at the end of the 6th day, she sat on the lowest terrace with her feet flat on the canyon floor and looked at what her hands had made. 4 planting beds stepped up the canyon floor like a rough, wide staircase, connected by water channels that fed slowly and continuously from the basin system above. The soil was dark and each bed packed, but not hard, and the smell of it in the cool canyon air was the smell of possibility, which is a very specific smell, and Vera had learned to trust it. Emmett came through the crack that evening with the last load of soil and stopped when he saw the terraces. He stood there for a moment. Vera, he said. It needed terracing, she said. I know, he stopped. Set down the bucket. Looked at the 4 beds, the water channels, the stone walls of the canyon going gold in the last light. How did you know how to do this? Vera thought about it for a moment. I didn't, she said. I just knew it needed to be done. It was in the second week that Surveyor Aldous found them. He came along the main trail with a mule string, a lean, sun-dried man with 20 years of territorial mapping behind him, and the particular brand of confidence that comes from knowing a landscape better than the people trying to live in it. He stopped to water his animals at the Holt's barrel. They'd set it outside the canyon entrance as a courtesy old territory habit, and Emmett offered him coffee, and he accepted. He was not a mean man, he was simply a certain one. Vera was inside the canyon when he arrived, working on the upper terrace. She heard the voices outside and came through the crack, wiping her hands on her work apron, and found Emmett and Aldous standing by the fire with their coffee cups. Aldous looked at the water channel running out across the gravel from the canyon entrance. He looked at the stack of extra soil bags. He looked at the tools laid out methodically against the canyon wall. Then he looked at Vera. This your idea, he asked. Yes, Vera said. He studied her for a moment with the eyes of a man who has spent 2 decades reading terrain. Then he shook his head with the slow certainty of an expert delivering news that is unfortunate but irrefutable. Nothing grows in canyon seeps, he said. Too little light, too little topsoil. The water looks reliable, but in a season like this, those seeps drop to almost nothing by October. You'll have frost in the canyon before anywhere else because cold air pools at the bottom of enclosed formations. He paused. I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it because I've mapped this country for 20 years, and I've seen men pour work into formations like this and walk away with nothing. He looked at Vera. You'll be gone by Christmas, he said, good intentions and all. Vera looked at him steadily. He was not unkind. He was also not right. She knew what she had seen in that canyon, and she knew what the water felt like under her palm, and she knew what the cottonwood tree meant, and she knew what 20 years of mapping a country was worth compared to 3 days of watching where the water moved and what the stone remembered about moisture. She did not say any of this. She looked at Emmett briefly and made the smallest possible gesture, a slight pressure of 2 fingers against his forearm. And Emmett, who understood her the way a good instrument understands the hand that plays it, went quiet and let Aldous finish his coffee in peace. When Aldous had ridden on, Emmett watched him go down the trail and said, He's not stupid. No, Vera agreed. He's just looking at the wrong things. She went back through the crack and picked up her pry bar. She planted the beans on a Thursday. The tin box of seeds had traveled from Kansas to New Mexico to the Arizona territory in the center of Vera's clothing trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and packed so carefully that when she opened it in the morning light on the flat stone outside the cabin, they'd finished the rough shell of the cabin, by then built into the back corner of the canyon. Using the 2 walls as 2 sides of the structure, it looked almost exactly as it had the day she'd packed it. She sorted the packets on the flat stone with the focused attention of a woman who understood precisely what she was looking at. Beans, squash, turnips, onion sets, a paper packet of lettuce. 3 cuttings of grapevine she'd kept alive in damp cloth since Kansas, their roots thin but persistent, like something that had decided not to die yet and was waiting to see whether the decision proved wise. A small bundle of strawberry runners from a neighbor's garden in New Mexico, wrapped in wet burlap, barely surviving but still in some technical and stubborn sense alive. She planted the beans and squash first because they were forgiving and fast, and she needed to see something respond before she trusted the rest. The lettuce went into the shadiest part of the lowest terrace, where the canyon wall blocked the brutal midday sun. The grapevine she pressed into the soil at the base of the warmest section of the right wall, the south-facing wall, the one that held heat and trained the first thin tendril against the stone with a length of cord. They may not take, she told Emmett. They may, he said. Jasper lay on his stomach with his chin in the dirt next to the first terrace, and watched the soil very seriously for several minutes as if expecting immediate results. "They're not doing anything," he said. "They're doing everything underground," Vera said. "You can't see it yet." Jasper considered this. "How do you know they're not just sitting there?" "Because that's what seeds do," Vera said. "They work in the dark." On the day the Aldises rode through heading toward Tucson, something else arrived, quieter and less welcome. It came in the form of a man named Leland Greer. He appeared one afternoon without introduction on a good horse with two hired hands, riding behind him at a respectful distance. He was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that has been weathered into something that looks like character, but is actually just exposure to sun and wind. He wore his clothes well. He had the practiced ease of a man who has never needed to hurry because the things he wants generally wait for him. He stopped at the canyon entrance and dismounted and walked toward where Emmett was cutting timber outside. Vera was inside the canyon. She heard the boots on gravel and came to the entrance crack and stood in it watching. Greer introduced himself to Emmett. He shook hands warmly. He admired the workmanship of the stone basins visible from the entrance. He asked how long they'd been out, how the horses were holding up, whether they'd had any trouble with the dry camp between here and the gap. He spoke with the relaxed fluency of a man making conversation he has made many times before and finds entirely comfortable. He did not look at Vera once. She was standing 12 feet away, clearly visible, and he did not look at her. He spoke exclusively to Emmett about the water, about the claim, about whether the family had filed the proper paperwork in Tucson before coming out, about what the territory required of homestead claimants in terms of improvement documentation. He asked about the seep system with what sounded like genuine technical interest. He asked about the soil source. He asked about the winter water table and canyon formations. Every question to Emmett. Vera watched him and did not move. When Greer had gathered what he'd come for, he shook Emmett's hand again and nodded in what might have been a general direction of courtesy and turned toward his horse. He paused with one boot in the stirrup and looked back at the canyon entrance. He looked at the water channel running out across the gravel. He looked at the tool marks on the stone where the first basin overflow had been cut. And for just a moment before he swung up into the saddle, he looked directly at Vera. It was not a long look. It was not threatening in any explicit way, but it was thorough in the way a man looks at something he is planning to take and is simply verifying that it is worth the effort of taking. Then he rode away. Emmett watched him go and said, "Neighborly enough. He'll come back," Vera said. Emmett turned. "What makes you say that?" Vera watched the riders disappear around the rock formation. The dust settled slowly in the still air. "He didn't look at me once," she said. "Not once. A man who comes to make trouble looks at the whole picture. A man who comes to look at what he wants looks only at what he wants." She turned back toward the canyon entrance. "He was looking at the water the whole time." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "He seemed—" "I know how he seemed," Vera said. "Come see the terraces. I want to show you something." They went inside. The canyon in the late afternoon light was something else entirely from what it was at midday. The high walls caught the western sun and turned it gold and copper and a deep reddish orange, and the water in the channels caught it too, running in thin, bright threads across the canyon floor. The four terraces stood against the back wall in their rough staircase arrangement, the dark soil in each one already beginning to settle and compact. The cottonwood in the far corner trembled slightly in the cool draft from the passage. Emmett stood in the center of the canyon and turned slowly, looking at all of it. "It looks like something," he said. "It looks like a garden," Vera said, "because that's what it is." She bent and touched the soil in the first terrace widely with her fingertips. It was the right temperature. Not too warm, not too cold. Just what it needed to be. She pressed two fingers an inch into the earth and felt the moisture from the water channel at work in the root zone below. The seeds were in the ground. The water was running. The walls rose 60 feet above them, solid and red and patient, holding the cooling air close like a house holds a family indifferently, which is to say permanently, which is to say without the possibility of anything else. Vera straightened. She looked at the crack in the wall, the narrow passage back to the desert, the pale rectangle of last light showing through, and then she looked at the canyon around her, and she allowed herself briefly one moment of the feeling she had been keeping carefully back since the morning she'd made the decision. Not hope, something stronger than hope. certainty. Then she picked up her pry bar and went back to work. The beans came up on a Thursday. 9 days after Vera had pressed them into the dark soil of the first terrace with her own fingers, 9 days after she had told Jasper that seeds work in the dark and you cannot see what they are doing, 14 bean seedlings pushed through the surface of the canyon floor in the thin, bright strip of morning sun that fell across the upper terrace between 8 and 10 o'clock each day. Vera was at the water basin when Jasper found them. He came running through the canyon, not yelling because Jasper was not a yelling child, but moving with the fast, serious purpose of someone carrying important news, and he stopped in front of his mother and said, "Mama, they're doing something." She followed him to the first terrace and crouched at the edge and counted. 14. She counted again to be sure. 14 seedlings curled and bright and entirely real, each one pushing up through the dark amended soil with the particular determination of something that has been waiting a long time for the right conditions and intends to make the most of them now that they've arrived. Vera stayed crouched at the edge of the terrace for a long moment. She did not smile immediately. She did not exclaim. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when a feeling was large enough that it needed a moment of containment before it could be let out safely. Her eyes moved across the 14 seedlings, one more time counting, without counting, just confirming what was there. Then she closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel it completely. Emmett had come through the canyon entrance with a load of timber for the cabin roof, and he set it down against the wall when he saw his wife crouched at the terrace with her eyes closed and his son standing beside her with his arms at his sides, watching her with the patient solemnity of a child who understands that something important is happening, even if he cannot name it precisely. "Vera," Emmett said. She opened her eyes, looked at him. 14, she said. He came and looked. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the 14 seedlings in the dark soil under the strip of canyon light, and then he put his hand on Vera's shoulder and left it there. Jasper crouched down and put his face very close to the nearest seedling, so close his nose was nearly touching it. "They're little," he said. "They'll get bigger," Vera said. "How big?" "Bigger than you." Jasper considered this with enormous seriousness. "Bigger than Papa." "Maybe not that big," Vera said, "but close." He seemed entirely satisfied by this answer. He stood up and looked at the seedling for another moment with the grave proprietary satisfaction of someone who has had a hand in something and intends to take the credit seriously. Then he said, "I'm going to talk to them every morning." "That's a good idea," Vera said. "Will it help?" "I think it might," she said, and she meant it. The squash followed within a week, broad-leafed and aggressive from the first, spreading faster than Vera had expected and requiring almost immediate intervention. She redirected the runners twice in the first 10 days, pinching back the most ambitious growth, installing low stone borders between the squash bed and the bean terrace to prevent the kind of hostile takeover that squash will attempt if given the chance. Jasper was deeply interested in the squash and spent long periods of time crouched beside the terrace, talking to the plants in a low, serious voice about their responsibilities. The lettuce in the lowest terrace was lush within 3 weeks, growing with a speed and tenderness that surprised even Vera. The combination of consistent moisture from the channel below and the sheltered warmth that pooled at the canyon's lowest point had done something to the soil that she hadn't entirely predicted unlocked. It was the word that came to mind. As if the ground had been waiting for exactly these conditions and had simply needed someone to provide them. They cut the first lettuce on an evening in early September and ate it at the small table Emmett had built from leftover timber inside the cabin. It was fresh and cold from the canyon air, and it tasted like nothing Vera had eaten in 2 years of dry camp and trail food and worry. Jasper chewed a leaf thoughtfully and said, "It tastes like water with green in it." Emmett laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere low in the chest, and Vera laughed too, and the sound of it filled the cabin and went up through the gap in the roof where the stovepipe ran and dispersed into the Arizona evening. And for a moment, the weight of 3 territories and 3 failures and 11 days of dry camp lifted completely, and there was just the 3 of them at the small table in the canyon with fresh lettuce and the water running softly outside. The community found them the way news always travels in open country, slowly at first and then all at once. Calhoun Briggs was a freighter who worked the route between Red Mercy Gap and the Tucson Road, a large red-faced man with a freighter's gift for conversation and a freighter's complete inability to keep a good story to himself. He spotted the Holt's wagon tracks turning off the main trail one October afternoon and followed them out of curiosity. He had always followed things out of curiosity, which had served him well as a freighter and occasionally gotten him into situations he hadn't planned on. He came through the canyon entrance and stood in the passage for a full minute before he came out the other side. Vera was tying up the grapevine tendril on the south wall when he emerged. Emmett was at the cabin. Jasper was sitting on the upper terrace, conducting what appeared to be a formal address to the bean plants. Briggs looked at the four terrace beds, the water channels, the vine on the south wall, the smoke from the cabin stovepipe rising above the canyon rim. He looked at Jasper on his terrace. He looked at Vera with her vine cord and her work-roughened hands and the calm competence she carried in every motion. Lord Almighty, Calhoun Briggs said. He was not a man of sophisticated expression, but he had an honest response to extraordinary things, and this qualified. He stayed for coffee and asked a great many questions and shook his head a great many times, and when he left that afternoon, he carried the story with him the way he carried everything efficiently, covering a lot of ground, not stopping until he delivered it. Within 3 weeks, 4 separate parties had come to look. The first 2 were simply curious families moving west or east along the Gap Road, stopping to rest their animals and see the thing Briggs had described. They looked at the terraces and the water system and the vine on the south wall and said things like extraordinary and never seen anything like it, and how did you know? And Vera answered their questions briefly and without elaboration and gave them water from the large basin and sent them on their way. The third party was the Marsh family. They came from the east with a wagon and 3 children and a look about them that Vera recognized immediately, the look of people who have been moving for a long time and are beginning to wonder if the moving will ever stop. Emmett invited them to camp outside the canyon entrance for the night, and they stayed 2 days. And on the second day, the Marsh family's father helped Emmett extend the water channel to a 5th terrace bed in the upper corner of the canyon, while Vera and the Marsh mother prepared a supper of fresh vegetables and cornbread on the iron stove. Willa Marsh was 12 years old, the eldest of the 3 children, with the careful, watchful manner of a child who has learned to pay attention, because attention is how you survive a long journey. She followed Vera into the garden on the second morning, without asking permission, simply appeared beside her while Vera was thinning the bean seedlings, and began watching with the focused intensity of someone trying to memorize a process they intend to repeat. Vera noticed but said nothing. She continued working. After a while, Willa said, "How do you know which ones to pull out?" "You look at the space between them," Vera said. "Each plant needs room to put out roots. If they're too close, they compete for the same water, and neither one does as well as it could. So you pull the smaller ones and give the stronger ones room." Willa crouched beside the terrace. "It seems hard, pulling something out when it's alive." "It is," Vera said, "but leaving too many in is worse. Sometimes thinning is the kindest thing." Willa considered this for a long moment, then picked up a small trowel from Vera's work apron pocket. Without asking, not rudely but with the directness of a child who is too interested to remember politeness, and began working the bed beside her. Vera led her. They worked together in the cool morning air of the canyon for an hour. Vera moving ahead, Willa following, and Vera talked about the vines and the soil and the water and what each plant needed and what it gave back, and Willa listened with the complete attention of someone storing every word. When the Marsh family left the next morning, Willa stood by the canyon entrance and looked at Vera with a child's direct seriousness. "I hope to have a garden like this one day," she said. "You will," Vera told her. "You already know how to thin." Willa Marsh got back on the wagon and they rolled away down the Gap Road, and Vera watched them go and felt something she didn't have a precise name for, a warmth that was different from the warmth of her own satisfaction. Wider somehow, as if the work she'd done in this canyon was not only for the 3 of them, but for something larger that she couldn't quite see yet. She went back inside to check on the squash. It was in the 3rd week of October that Leland Greer returned. Vera had been expecting him. Not specifically, not on that Tuesday, not at that hour. But she had been expecting him the way you expect certain weather, when the conditions are right, not with certainty about the timing, but with no doubt at all about the eventual arrival. She was inside the canyon when she heard the horses outside. Multiple horses. She came through the crack to find Greer dismounting from his good horse, and behind him a younger man climbing down from a second horse with a leather case under his arm, and the careful, measured movements of someone in a profession that teaches caution about how one is seen to behave. Greer looked different from the first visit. The warmth was still there, the practiced ease, the good-natured manner of a prosperous man who finds the world generally agreeable. But there was something underneath it now that had not been visible before, or that Vera had not been meant to see. A settled quality. The quality of a man who has done his research and made his decision and is here now to begin the formal process of getting what he came for. Emmett came around from the side of the canyon where he'd been working on the roof extension. Greer greeted him warmly, shook hands, introduced the younger man a Mr. Fenwick from a Tucson law office. Very cordial, very professional. And then, as before Greer spoke entirely to Emmett, he spoke about the territory, about the water rights situation in the Gap region, about the survey claims that had been filed by various parties over the past several years. He spoke with the patient clarity of someone explaining something complex to someone who may not have all the relevant information. He mentioned a land company based in Tucson. He mentioned a survey conducted 4 years prior. He mentioned the seep system feeding this particular canyon formation and the question of whether that seep system fell within a prior claim boundary established by the aforementioned survey. He said all of this to Emmett. Vera stood 6 feet away, and Greer did not once turn his head in her direction. Then Fenwick opened his leather case and produced a folded document, and Greer took it and held it out to Emmett. Emmett took it. He looked at it briefly, then looked at Vera. She crossed the gravel to his side and took the document from his hand and opened it and read it. She read it completely. Every word. It was a formal notice of competing claim, a legal instrument filed by a Tucson land company, asserting that the water seep system feeding this canyon formation fell within the eastern boundary of a survey claim established in 1884. It did not order them to leave. It was more precise than that. It informed them that their existing homestead filing might be insufficient to protect their water rights, and that if they could not demonstrate both a valid land claim and independent water rights, they could face a formal challenge hearing before the Territorial Land Office. Vera folded it back exactly as it had been folded. She looked at it for a moment in her hands. Then she looked up at Greer directly, clearly, without hurry, and said, "Thank you for bringing this in person, Mr. Greer." It was the first time she had spoken. Greer looked at her as if slightly surprised to find her capable of it. He adjusted his expression into something that was technically gracious. "Of course," he said, "just making sure the family has the full picture." "We have it," Vera said. There was a brief pause. Then Greer nodded, and he and Fenwick got back on their horses, and they rode away. Emmett waited until they were out of earshot. "What does it say?" "They're trying to take the water," Vera said. "Not the land, the water." "Can they?" She looked at the document again. "Not if the survey they're using has errors. And survey documents from that period often do." She folded it again and tucked it into her apron pocket. "We need to go to Tucson." Emmett said, "I'll go." "We'll go," Vera said, "together." She looked at him steadily. "This isn't a job for one of us." Emmett knew better than to argue with that particular tone. "What about Jasper?" "Willa Marsh's family is 2 days east. I'll send word. Clara can watch him for 4 days." Emmett looked at her for a long moment. Then, "All right." They arranged the canyon for their absence with the thoroughness of people leaving something they intend to come back to. Vera adjusted the basin overflow gate, a flat piece of fitted slate that Emmett had built into the main channel, so the water would continue to flow at a reduced rate while they were gone, keeping the terrace soil moist without flooding. She left Jasper with instructions about the grapevine tendril and a list of what to tell Willa if any of the plants looked wrong, which she delivered with enough specificity that Jasper wrote it on the back of his hand in pencil. He was 5. He could not yet write. But he held the pencil solemnly and made marks and said he understood. And Vera believed him because Jasper understood most things that were explained to him clearly. They left at first light. The ride to Tucson was 2 days in good conditions. The conditions were not good. A dry headwind from the north that coated everything in fine red dust and wore at the horses, but they made it by the evening of the second day and found a room at a boarding house on the south side of the town, a narrow room with a window that looked onto an alley and a bed that was clean, if not comfortable. Vera sat on the edge of the bed that night with Greer's document on her knee, and read it again this time with a pencil in her hand, making small notations in the margins. Emmett sat in the chair by the window and watched her and didn't speak because he had learned over 7 years that Vera thinking was a process best left uninterrupted. After a while, she said, "The survey they're using was filed in 1884 by a company called Meridian Land and Titles. The boundary line they're claiming runs northeast from a marker at Red Mercy Gap, along what the document calls the primary ridge formation." She paused. "But every map I've seen of this area describes the northeast quadrant differently. The ridge formation doesn't look the same on any two surveys." Emmett said, "That's either incompetence or fraud. Either way, it's an error," Vera said, "and errors in survey documents can be challenged." In the morning, they went to the land office. It occupied a corner building on the main street, low-ceilinged and crowded with wooden filing cabinets, and the accumulated paperwork of a territory that had been divided and claimed and disputed and redivided for 20 years. The clerk was a man named Tatum, older, thin, with the unhurried manner of someone who had processed enough competing claims to have stopped being surprised by any of them. He laid out the relevant documents with the weary patience of a man who has had this conversation many times and expects it to end the same way it usually ends. He spoke primarily to Emmett. Emmett answered a few questions and then went quiet. Because Vera had begun to listen, she sat beside Emmett at the scarred wooden desk and listened to Tatum explain the competing claim and the survey boundary and the water rights situation in the Northeast Gap region with the complete attention she brought to everything that mattered. And while she listened, she was looking at the map Tatum had spread across the desk, looking at it the way she had looked at the canyon the first time she'd walked through it, not for what it showed, but for what it didn't quite say. She saw it in the third minute. "Mr. Tatum," she said. Both men looked at her. "The northeast corner point on Meridian's 1884 survey," she said. "What physical feature is it anchored to?" Tatum looked at her for a moment with the brief recalibration of a man who has not expected the question to come from where it came from. Then he looked at the map. "It's recorded as a ridge formation, primary outcropping northeast face." "Which outcropping specifically?" Vera said. "Is it marked on any other survey document from that period?" Tatum was quiet for a moment. He opened one of the filing drawers behind him and produced another document, an older survey map. Different hand, different year. He laid it next to the Meridian document and looked between them. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "The northeast corner point." "Yes," Vera said. "It's placed on a rock formation." He traced a line with his finger. "That doesn't appear on any other survey from this area." "Including the territorial baseline survey from 1879? Vera said. Tatum went to a different drawer. He was moving faster now with the energy of a man who has found something he wasn't looking for and has the professional integrity to follow it wherever it goes. He produced a third document and spread it on the desk. He compared all three. "The northeast corner point is placed on a formation that doesn't exist on the 1879 baseline," he said slowly, "which means the entire eastern boundary of the Meridian claim may be shifted." He looked up at Vera. "By how much depends on where the actual formation is, if it exists at all?" "It doesn't," Vera said quietly. "I've been through that country twice in the past month. There's no rock formation of that description at the northeast corner. There's a dry wash and about 200 yards of broken flat rock and nothing else." Tatum sat back in his chair. He looked at the three maps on his desk. Then he looked at Vera with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. Not reluctant, not condescending. Something more like respect, arriving a little late, but arriving. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "this is a genuine discrepancy. It doesn't resolve today. The Meridian claim will have to be reviewed independently and the boundary line resurveyed before anything is settled. But a homestead with your level of documented improvement." He glanced at the written account Vera had placed on his desk that morning, the 12 pages of dates and dimensions and materials, on a claim with a cleaner original filing than the competing notice, and with a survey error of this magnitude in the competitor's chain. "That's a strong position." He paused. "A strong position," he said again carefully. "Not a certainty, but strong." Vera nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Tatum." They walked out of the land office into the Tucson afternoon, the sun still high and hard in the white sky, and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Emmett was quiet. He had been largely quiet for the past 4 hours, and Vera knew him well enough to know that it was not the quiet of a man who was frustrated, but the quiet of a man who is thinking hard and not in any hurry to interrupt a process that seems to be going correctly. "You saw that in the document last night," he said finally. It was not a question. "I saw it was possible," Vera said. "I needed Tatum to confirm it with the other surveys." Emmett was quiet for another moment. "Then the survey error. You found it." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't quite read his expression. It was too many things at once, and Emmett's face was not a face that showed its contents easily. But one thing in it was clear and uncomplicated. Pride. The specific pride of a man who has been trusted to stand beside someone and has done it without getting in the way. "All right," he said. "What do we do now?" "We go back," Vera said, "and we wait." The ride home was 2 days in the same dry headwind. They arrived at the canyon in the small hours of the fourth day, the horses moving steadily through the desert, dark, the stars enormous over the red rock country. Vera climbed down from the wagon before Emmett and went to the canyon entrance and put her hand against the stone of the crack. It was cool under her palm. The air moving through from inside carried the smell she had come to know as the smell of the canyon itself, damp stone and the faint green smell of the growing beds, and something underneath it very faint like the smell of deep water. She went through. Inside the canyon, the water was running in the channels. The terrace beds were dark and moist in the starlight. The grapevine tendril on the south wall had grown 2 more inches. While she was gone, she could tell by the position of the cord she'd tied and was reaching further up the warm stone with the patient authority of something that has found the right conditions and intends to stay. Vera stood in the center of the canyon in the dark and breathed it in. Then she went to the cabin and lit the lamp, and Emmett came through behind her, and they sat at the small table and didn't say much for a while because there wasn't much that needed saying. The document was in Vera's apron pocket. The survey error was in Tatum's files. The water was running outside. After a while, Emmett said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," Vera said. "That night before we left, when you told me you were afraid." She looked at him. "You said you were afraid you'd been wrong," he said, "that the decision to stay was wrong, that you'd pulled us into something that wasn't going to hold." "I remember," Vera said. "I should have said something then that I didn't say," Emmett said. He looked at the table. He was not comfortable with long speeches, and he didn't make them. But when he arrived at something important, he said it plainly and without decoration. "Every decision that's kept us alive and moving forward in the last 3 years has been yours. Kansas, you said go. I wanted to stay. New Mexico, you said the frost would come again. I said maybe not. This canyon." He stopped. "I walked through that crack and saw rock and shadow. You walked through and saw this." He looked up. "I trust what you see, Vera. I have trusted it for 7 years. I should have said that instead of telling you that we could build somewhere else if we had to." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "We could," she said. "We could build somewhere else." "I know," Emmett said. "But you were right that it wasn't comforting." She almost smiled. "No, it wasn't." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was rough from the timber work, the skin cracked at the knuckles from the dry air. She turned hers over and held it. "We're not going anywhere," she said. "No," Emmett agreed. "We're not." Outside the cabin in the canyon that Vera had made from a crack in a rock wall and 3 seeps of water and 12 loads of soil from a dry wash 2 miles south, the water ran on in its channels without pause, indifferent and faithful and entirely unconcerned with the business of human worry. The grapevine held the warm wall. The terrace beds held the dark soil. The cottonwood in the far corner held its roots deep in the ground where the water had always been. And in the morning when the strip of sun came down between the canyon walls at 8 o'clock and fell across the upper terrace, Jasper Holt was already there sitting cross-legged in front of the bean plants, conducting his morning address in a low and earnest voice, explaining to them the importance of growing tall. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Monday in the first week of December. Emmett brought it in from the Gap Road where the mail rider had left it at the stone marker they'd built at the trail junction, a small Karen Vera's idea, so the rider would know someone lived out here and have a place to leave things without having to come all the way to the canyon entrance. Emmett carried it inside and set it on the table without opening it, the way a man sets down something he is not entirely sure he is ready to hold. Vera was at the stove. She heard him come in and heard the particular sound of paper on wood and turned around. She looked at the letter. Then she looked at Emmett. He said, "It came." She crossed to the table and picked it up. The envelope was official, the territorial seal in the upper corner, the land office address printed in careful block letters beneath it. Her name was not on it. Emmett Holt, it said, head of Household Holt Homestead, claim Red Mercy Gap territory. She noted this without comment and opened it anyway because it was her letter in every way that mattered. She read it standing at the table. It was not a short document. It was written in the careful, layered language of territorial administration, which had been developed over decades specifically to say things without quite saying them, and it required a slow and patient reading to understand what was actually being communicated beneath the formal phrasing. Vera read it once through completely. Then she set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went outside. Not to find Emmett. He was right behind her, and she knew it, and she needed a moment that was only hers. She went through the canyon entrance and stood in the passage for a moment, that narrow corridor of stone 20 inches wide, the rock brushing both her shoulders the way it had the very first time, and then she came out into the canyon. It was early morning and the sun had not yet reached the canyon floor. The walls were in shadow, the deep red sandstone gone gray and cool in the pre-dawn light, and the water in the channels caught what light there was and threw it back in thin wavering lines. The terrace beds were dark and still. The grapevine on the south wall had lost its leaves in the cold they'd fallen in November. Brown and dry, but the vine itself was still there, its woody stems pressed against the warm stone, and at the points where Vera had tied the cord, she could see the tight, hard buds that meant it was dormant, not dead. She sat on the edge of the first terrace. The cold of the stone went through her coat immediately, but she didn't move. She sat and looked at the canyon in the gray morning light, at the 4 terrace beds she had built with her own hands from flat stones and red clay mortar, at the water channel she had cut through the stone with a chisel over the course of many patient days, at the cottonwood in the back corner standing bare and gray now, but rooted deep at the cabin wall, visible through the morning shadows with its juniper timber and its oilcloth window letting out the faint warmth of the banked stove inside. She had made all of this. Not alone, Emmett had hauled the soil and cut the timber and built the roof and done 100 other things that she could not have done without him. But the shape of it, the idea of it, the decision that had turned a crack in a rock wall into this that had been hers. On a night when Emmett slept, she had sat with her back against the wagon wheel and looked at a dark seam in the desert stone and seen something that no one else had seen, and she had decided, and this was what the decision had made. Vera pressed her lips together. She had spent 3 years being afraid of droughts, of frosts, of bad maps and land agents' promises, and the particular terror of watching something you've built begin to fail. She had carried that fear carefully the way she carried the canteen rationing, it never letting it show because showing it served nothing and someone had to keep moving. She was not afraid now. She put her hands flat on her knees and breathed in the cold canyon air and let the feeling come fully, all of it, without managing it or containing it or deciding what to do with it next. It was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of a door that has been locked for a very long time, finally opening, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just opening, just being open, just being the thing it was always supposed to be. Her eyes filled. She let them. She sat on the edge of the first terrace in the cold gray morning of the canyon and cried without making any sound, the tears running down her face and dropping into the dark soil of the terrace bed below, and the water ran in the channels around her, and the walls rose 60 feet above her, and the canyon held her exactly as it had always held, everything close and faithful and entirely indifferent to anything except the fact of her presence within it. After a while, she heard Emmett come through the entrance crack. He crossed the canyon floor and sat down beside her on the terrace edge and did not say anything. He had read the letter she had known he would, and she had left it on the table for that reason. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat like that in the cold for a long time. Eventually, Vera said, "We won." "You won," Emmett said. She shook her head. "We won," she said again firmly, because it was the truth, and she intended it to be the truth, even if it was not the whole truth. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then Tatum was right. The survey error held. The survey error I found, Vera said quietly, and it was not boasting. It was just the fact of it said plainly, because she had spent too many years watching the facts of things get reassigned to say it any other way. Yes, Emmett said, the survey error you found. They sat a little longer. Then Jasper appeared in the cabin doorway in his socks, in his sleeping shirt, with his hair standing up on one side and said, "Why is everyone outside? It's cold." "Come out here," Vera said. "I don't have my boots." "Then get your boots." He disappeared and came back 45 seconds later with his boots on and his coat over his sleeping shirt and his hair still entirely unaddressed. He crossed the canyon floor with the determined stride of a 5-year-old who has decided to take a situation seriously and sat down on the other side of Vera and looked at the terrace beds in the morning light. "What are we doing?" he asked. "Looking at what we built," Vera said. Jasper looked. He had the good sense even at 5 to understand when something deserved a moment of genuine attention. He looked at the terrace beds and the water channels and the bare grapevine on the south wall and the cottonwood in the back corner. "It's still ours," he asked. "It's still ours," Vera said. "Completely and officially. Nobody can take it." Jasper nodded with the grave satisfaction of someone receiving confirmation of something they had never seriously doubted. Then he said, "Can I have breakfast?" Vera laughed. It came out of her easily without effort, the way laughter does when the weight that has been pressing on it for months finally lifts. "Yes," she said, "you can have breakfast." She went inside and built up the fire and made cornbread, and they ate it at the small table with the morning light coming through the oilcloth window in its pale winter version, thin and silver rather than gold. And after breakfast, Vera took the letter from the table and folded it carefully along its original creases and carried it to the shelf where she kept the tin box of seeds. She opened the box. Inside the remaining seed packets in their oilcloth wrappings, the stub of pencil she used for planting notes, the land agent's map, with her water calculations scratched on the back. She lifted the seed packets and placed the folded letter at the very bottom of the box beneath everything else. Then she replaced the seed packets on top of it and closed the lid. It belonged there, with the seeds, with the things that had made this possible. She put the box back on the shelf and went to check on the grapevine. Winter settled into the canyon with a cold that was sharp and clean rather than brutal. The enclosed walls blocked the worst of the desert wind, and the stone itself held what warmth the sun put into it through the middle of the day and released it slowly through the nights. So the temperature in the canyon rarely dropped as low as it did in the open desert outside. Vera had been right about this in her nighttime calculations back in August, and being right about it now in the physical reality of December gave her a satisfaction that was quiet and specific and entirely her own. She spent the winter improving. The water system first. She had been planning the second distribution basin since October, and she built it now below the first, connected by a short channel with a stone gate that could be opened or closed with the fitted slate piece Emmett cut for her, allowing water to be directed to individual terrace beds as it needed, rather than flowing continuously to all of them. It took 12 days of steady work in the cold, and her hands ached with it every evening. But when it was done, she could water the upper terraces while leaving the lower ones dry, or flood the bean beds, while keeping the squash roots firm. And this precision felt like a different order of capability entirely from what she'd had in the fall. She lined the main channel with a course of flat stone fitted without mortar, so finely joined that the water barely lost any to seepage before it reached the garden. She built a root cellar into the back wall of the canyon 3 feet into the soft stone, lined with flat slabs cool enough in testing to hold a vegetable through the worst summer heat without spoilage. Emmett built things too, a proper door for the cabin fitted with iron hinges he had had the smith in Tucson make to Vera's specifications. A second window on the north wall to improve the cross-draft in summer. A better woodshed against the outside of the canyon wall, roofed with juniper planking. He worked steadily and without complaint through the cold months, building the permanence of the place the way he built everything methodically, without drama, one task at a time. Jasper grew. He grew the way children grow in good conditions, fast and almost imperceptibly, so that one morning Vera looked at him, standing in the cabin doorway, and realized he was half an inch taller than he had been in October, and she did not know exactly when it had happened. He spent his mornings in the canyon regardless of the cold, talking to the dormant plants, with the faithful regularity of a person maintaining a relationship through a difficult season, explaining to the bare beanstalks that he expected them to return in the spring and expected them to be larger than before. They can't hear you, Emmett told him once in the mild way of a man who doesn't actually disagree with what he's saying. Mama says Jasper said. Emmett looked at Vera. I said they know when you're present, Vera said, which is different from hearing, but also maybe not entirely different. Emmett appeared to find this a satisfying answer. He went back to work on the door. In the deep of January, when the days were short and the canyon walls cut the sunlight to a few hours on the floor, and Vera was spending her evenings by lamplight reading the 2 agricultural books she'd carried since Kansas until she could have recited chapters from memory, Surveyor Aldous came back. She heard the horse outside on a gray afternoon and came through the entrance crack to find him standing at the canyon entrance, and alone, no mule string. This time, no companion. Just Aldous on his horse, which he had tied to the wheel of their spare wagon, and he was standing with his hat in his hands, looking at the water channel running out across the gravel and the smoke from the cabin stovepipe rising above the canyon rim. He did not appear to have a specific reason for being there. Vera came out and stood at the canyon entrance and looked at him. He looked at her. He was a lean, sun-dried man of perhaps 55, and the face that had delivered its verdict about this canyon in October, professional, certain carrying the authority of 20 years of territorial knowledge, was the same face now, but something in it had shifted. Not humbled exactly. Aldous did not look like a man given to humbling, but recalibrated, adjusted. The face of a man who takes his craft seriously enough to update his conclusions when the evidence requires it. He looked at the water channel. He looked at the neat stonework visible in the channel bed from where he stood. He looked at the stovepipe smoke. Then he looked at Vera, and he took a breath as if preparing to say something, and then appeared to decide against it. Instead, he put his hat back on and nodded once clearly directly at her and turned to his horse. Emmett had come through the entrance crack behind Vera. Do you want coffee? He called. Aldous paused with one boot in the stirrup. He seemed to consider it genuinely. Then thank you, no. He swung up. Just passing through. He rode away down the gap road and disappeared around the rock formation. Emmett watched him go. What was that about? Nothing, Vera said. Everything. She looked at the place where Aldous had stood, and at the water channel he had looked at, and at the smoke still threading up from the stovepipe. He came to see if we were still here. And now he knows. She turned back toward the entrance. That's enough for him. Emmett thought about this for a moment. He didn't apologize. No, Vera said. He's not the apologizing kind. She paused at the entrance crack. But he came. That's the version of it he knows how to give. She went inside. She had been right about it, had known it, when she had made the smallest gesture to Emmett back in October, 2 fingers on his forearm, not worth saying anything, and she was right about it now. Some acknowledgments do not come in words. They come in the form of a man riding 20 miles out of his way to look at a thing he said would fail, and then putting his hat back on and saying nothing because nothing is the only honest thing left to say. Spring arrived early. The first sign was not temperature, but light. The angle of the morning sun as it came over the east wall began to shift in late February, reaching deeper into the canyon floor, staying longer on the upper terraces. Vera noticed it first by the warmth on the back of her hands while she was working the soil in the second week of March, a specific quality of warmth different from the winter sun's pale effort, something with actual work in it. She stood up and turned her face toward it. The grapevines showed new growth on a Thursday morning, the third week of March. Vera had been watching them daily through the winter, not anxiously but consistently, the way she watched everything in the canyon with the regular attention that knows the difference between a dormant thing and a dead one. The vines had been dormant. She had been certain of it, certain enough not to pull them out, certain enough to keep the cord ties in place through the cold months and adjust them twice when the frost-expanded stone shifted slightly. She came to check them on the Thursday morning and found it small, tight points of green pushing through the dry bark at 3 separate nodes along the main stem. Not leaves yet, just the beginning of leaves, the first insistence of them compact and definitive. She put her finger very gently against one. It was firm, real, entirely committed. She went and found Emmett at the woodshed and brought him into the canyon and showed him without speaking, just pointing. He looked at the green points on the vine for a long moment. You kept those alive since Kansas, he said. Almost 3 years, Vera said. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the specific amazement of a man recognizing the duration of patience he has been watching without fully understanding. What do you need, he said, to give them the best chance? More pegs in the south wall, Vera said. I want to extend the training along the full length. And I'll need cord, the hemp, not the cotton. It lasts longer. I'll get it today, Emmett said. The strawberry runners came next, two white blossoms pushing up from the lowest terrace on a morning in late March, pale and delicate against the red stone of the terrace edge, looking entirely improbable in the Arizona desert and entirely unconcerned about it. Vera called Jasper to see them, and he lay flat on his stomach on the canyon floor, with his chin propped in his hands, and studied the blossoms for a long time. They're small, he said. They'll fruit by May, Vera said. Will they taste good? They'll taste like strawberries, Vera said, which is the best thing anything tastes like. Jasper considered this with full seriousness. Better than cornbread. Different from cornbread, Vera said. Both are the best. He appeared to find this philosophically acceptable. She planted the spring beds in the first week of April, beans in the upper terrace again, squash in the second, a second planting of lettuce in the lowest terrace, where it had done so well the previous season. New onion sets, turnips in the deep amended soil of the third bed, where she'd been composting through the winter. And in the fourth terrace, the one that caught the most of the morning sun, she pressed in the last of the seed packets. She had been saving a paper envelope of early corn that she had been carrying since Kansas and had not planted, yet had not trusted any ground enough for yet. This ground she trusted. The beans germinated in 6 days. Jasper, who had been conducting daily sessions of encouragement at the terrace, received this as direct confirmation of his method and announced it with complete composure. Willa Marsh came back in April. She came alone. Her family was 2 days east, and she had ridden the distance herself on the family's spare horse, which said something about either her determination or the estimation her parents had of her capability, and Vera suspected it was both. She appeared at the canyon entrance on a Tuesday morning with a bedroll and a canvas sack in the direct manner of a young person who has thought carefully about whether they are welcome and decided to arrive anyway, and let the facts speak for themselves. Vera was at the south wall working the grapevine when she heard boots on gravel and turned. Willa stood at the entrance. I came to learn more, she said. If that's all right. Vera looked at her for a moment, 12 years old, trail-dusted, entirely composed, her eyes already moving past Vera to the green points of the grapevine on the warm stone. Come see the vine, Vera said. Willa spent 4 days at the canyon. She slept in the cabin on a bedroll near the stove and ate with the family and worked from morning until the light failed. She was a fast learner, faster than fast, the kind of learner who arrives already halfway there by the quality of their attention. Vera taught her the grapevine, how to train the new growth along the pegs, which nodes to encourage and which to pinch back, how to read the vine's own direction and work with it rather than against it. She taught her how to read the soil moisture without instruments by color and by the way it compressed between the fingers. She taught her how the water gate worked, how to adjust the flow for different beds, how to tell by the edge color of a leaf when a plant was getting too much water and when not enough. Willa absorbed all of it without visible effort, the way a dry thing absorbs water completely and immediately leaving no visible surface. Trace the intake happening somewhere underneath where you couldn't see it. On the third day, working side by side in the bean terrace, Willa said, My mother says you made all this from nothing. Not nothing, Vera said. There was water here already. I just gave it somewhere to go. Willa was quiet, working the soil around a bean seedling with careful fingers. But nobody else would have seen it. My father says a dozen wagon trains must have passed that crack in the wall without stopping. Maybe, Vera said. How did you know to stop? Vera thought about it. She thought about the canteen in her lap, and her eyes moving along the rock face, and Jasper chewing his apricot, and the cool air near the entrance and the smell of wet stone. I didn't know, she said finally. I just wasn't done looking. Willa turned this over for a moment. Then she nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing politely, but the nod of someone filing something away. When the Marsh family's wagon appeared at the Gap Road on the fourth day to collect Willa, the girls stood at the canyon entrance for a moment before climbing up to the seat. She looked at Vera with the clear, direct gaze she had brought to everything for 4 days. "I'll have a garden like this," she said. "Not hoped, not wanted. Will." "Yes," Vera said, "you will." She watched the wagon roll away down the gap road and stood in the desert sun outside the canyon entrance for a moment. The spring air was warmer now, the rock face warm to the touch on either side of the crack, and inside the canyon behind her the water ran in its channels, and the vines grew along the warm wall, and Jasper's voice could be heard delivering his morning address to the bean seedlings with considerable authority. Vera turned back and went through the crack. The summer of 1889 passed in the way that good summers pass when you are finally in the right place, doing the right work, full of days that are hard and warm and satisfying, in the specific way that physical labor in good conditions is satisfying, where the body's tiredness at the end of the day is not the tiredness of endurance but of accomplishment. The canyon held its temperature through the hottest weeks, the walls absorbing the sun's assault and releasing it slowly in the evenings. And the nights were genuinely cool, cool enough for sleep, cool enough for the comfort that makes the next day's work possible. The corn in the fourth terrace came up strong and grew faster than Vera had expected, reaching the height of the terrace wall by July, and continuing the stalks thick and well anchored in the deep amended soil. She had planted it on faith, and it had answered the faith directly, and she allowed herself a certain satisfaction about this in the evenings, when she walked the terrace beds after supper. Jasper grew another inch. He claimed this was because of the beans he had grown himself, and maintained this position firmly against all alternative explanations. Emmett tried once to suggest that diet and fresh air were also factors, and Jasper heard him out with perfect politeness, and then said that he understood his father's perspective, but thought the beans deserved the primary credit. Emmett told Vera later that the boy was going to be a lawyer. "Or a farmer," Vera said. "Or both," Emmett said. The grapes turned in August. It happened over 3 weeks, a slow procession from green to pale gold, to the deep blue-black of fully ripe, the clusters heavy and tight on their train vines along the south wall, filling out in the warm, reflected heat that gathered against the stone in the afternoons. Vera checked them daily, pressing a berry gently between her fingers, reading the give of the skin and the color of the juice, and the smell that came off them in the afternoon warmth. On an evening in the third week of August, she picked one and pressed it between her fingers and tasted it. She stood at the south wall in the canyon's evening light, with the taste of it on her tongue, deep and complex and entirely present, nothing like the thin sweetness of the cuttings she had coaxed across 3 territories in damp cloth. Everything like what she had believed they could become if she could only get them to the right ground. She stood there a moment longer than was necessary. Her eyes went bright and then quiet the way they did when a thing resolved completely. She went to find Emmett. He was at the woodshed. She came to him and held out her palm with a cluster of 3 grapes in it, and he took one and ate it and then stood very still for a moment. "Vera," he said. "I know," she said. 3 years. "And 2 months," she said, "from Kansas." He looked at the cluster in his palm and then at the canyon entrance behind her, the crack in the wall showing as a line of late gold light. "You carried them from Kansas," he said, "in damp cloth." "I wasn't sure they'd make it," Vera said. "I wasn't sure any of it would make it. But you carried them anyway." "I carried them anyway," she said. The harvest came with September. It came on a morning of clear early light when the sun came over the east wall and turned the canyon gold from the top down the rim first, then the upper terraces, then the water channels catching it in their bright running lines, then the full floor of the canyon in the complete warm light of a September morning in the Arizona Territory, which is a specific quality of light that has no equivalent anywhere else, clean and direct and generous in the way that things are generous when the hard work of summer is done. Vera stood at the canyon entrance that morning before anyone else was up. She stood in the crack itself in the passage, the stone brushing both shoulders the way it had the very first time, and she looked through at the canyon. She looked at it the way she had looked at it that first time from outside from the entrance, before she knew what she would make of it. But now the inside of the frame was different. Where there had been rock and shadow and seeping water and a single cottonwood, there was now the grapevine dark and heavy on the south wall, the terrace beds stacked in their rough staircase with the last of the summer growth. Still in them, the water channels running in their stone-lined courses, the cabin in the back corner with its juniper door and its oilcloth windows, the cottonwood spreading its autumn gold leaves in the cool draft from the passage. She had made all of this. She stood in the entrance crack and looked at what 3 years of moving and failing and deciding and building had made, and she let herself look at it completely, without managing the looking, without planning what came next. Then Jasper appeared behind her in his boots, and his coat materialized out of the cabin, the way he materialized out of things as if he had been there for a while already, and was simply making his presence official. "Is it harvest day?" he asked. "It is," Vera said. He pushed past her through the entrance crack with the urgency of someone who has been waiting for this specific day and does not intend to let it begin without him. He crossed the canyon floor at a trot and went directly to the bean terrace and stood in front of it and surveyed it with his arms crossed and his chin up in the proprietary attitude of a grower checking on his crop. Emmett came through the entrance behind Vera. He stood beside her and looked at the canyon in the morning light and then looked at Jasper at his terrace. "Ready," Emmett said. Vera had built 2 wide harvest baskets from bent willow and canvas the previous winter. She had made a third one for Jasper, just his size, fitted with a proper handle he could carry with both hands. She got them from the cabin shelf and carried Jasper's to him, and he took it with both hands in the deliberate seriousness of someone accepting a significant responsibility. They worked through the morning without hurrying. Vera moved along the grapevine first, lifting each cluster with both hands, feeling the weight of them, setting each one into the wide basket with the care that 3 years of work deserved. The fruit came away dark and heavy and smelling of the warm south wall and the long summer and the patient accumulation of every day since she'd pressed the thin roots into the soil at the base of the stone and tied the first tendril with a length of cord. Emmett worked the squash and the bean beds, moving down the terraces with the methodical steadiness he brought to everything, the baskets filling slowly with the gold green of the squash and the lung of fat bean pods and the fat pale turnips he pulled from the deep soil of the third terrace and shook clean. Jasper worked the bean terrace. He worked it with complete seriousness and an attention to thoroughness that Vera watched from the corner of her eye with a feeling she had no adequate word for. He moved along the row the way she had taught him, checking each plant, picking the pods that were ready, and leaving the ones that needed another day, setting each one into his basket with a care that was almost ceremonial. When his basket was full, which did not take long given its size, and given that Jasper was constitutionally unable to resist putting things in containers, he carried it to the center of the canyon floor and set it down and stood behind it with his hands at his sides looking at it. Vera brought her grape basket and set it beside his. Emmett came with the squash basket and set it beside hers. The three of them stood in the center of the canyon on the harvest morning with the baskets full in front of them, and the walls rising 60 feet on every side, and the water running soft and steady in the channels, and the cottonwood overhead in its autumn gold, and the sun fully down now on the canyon floor, warming everything generous and complete. Jasper looked at the baskets. He looked at the terrace beds and the grapevine and the water channels and the cabin in the back corner and the crack in the wall behind them, where the desert outside showed as a pale strip of ordinary light. Then he looked up at his mother. "We did this," he said. Vera looked at her son. She looked at the baskets. She looked at Emmett beside her, at his rough hands and his steady face and the 7 years of trust between them that had made this as much as the water and the soil had made it. "We did," she said. Emmett looked at her and she looked back at him, and there was nothing in the look that needed translating. It was the look of two people who have been through the same hard thing and come out the other side of it, still standing together, and some portion of what they had come through was carried in the look itself and needed no other acknowledgement. Vera reached down and lifted one cluster of grapes from the harvest basket and held it for a moment, the weight of it in her palm, dark and full and real. She thought about the oilcloth wrapping in the bottom of the clothing trunk and the dry wash 2 miles south, and the night she had sat with her back against the wagon wheel and decided in the dark without telling anyone. She thought about the chisel ringing against the stone and the red clay mortar drying in the afternoon heat, and the 14 bean seedlings on a Thursday morning that had been the first confirmation that the decision had been right. She thought about the survey map on Tatum's desk and the error she had found in the third minute, and Greer's horse disappearing around the rock formation, and Aldous' single nod in the cold January air. She thought about the tin box on the shelf with the letter at the bottom of it under the seed packets. She set the grape cluster back in the basket. The canyon held them the way it had always held everything, close and cool and faithful and entirely unconcerned with anything except the ongoing fact of their presence within it. The water ran in the channels without pause. The vines held the warm wall. The soil in the terrace beds held what had been planted in it and given back more than had been given. Outside the crack in the wall, the desert stretched away in every direction, bone white and merciless, and entirely unchanged, the same hard country it had always been. The same country that Surveyor Aldous had mapped for 20 years. The same country the land agent's vague map had promised and failed to deliver. The same country that had taken 3 years and three territories and more fear than Vera would ever fully account for. But here behind the crack in the wall and the 40 feet of sheltered red stone that nobody had known about, and one woman had decided to trust the water ran, and the grapes were dark and the beans were fat. And the boy who had talked to the seedlings all winter was standing in the canyon light with his small basket and his enormous seriousness, entirely certain that this place was his and always had been. Vera looked at the crack in the wall one more time. Then she bent and picked up her basket, and the harvest was real and heavy in her hands, and she carried it inside.